October 1995, a small ceremony room in Brussels, and 78-year-old Elizabeth Harding sits in a wheelchair, hands trembling as she holds a medal that should have been presented 50 years earlier. Around her stand 6 elderly men, former German prisoners of war she'd nursed back to health in a makeshift field hospital outside Bastogne in December 1944. They've traveled from Munich, Berlin and Cologne to witness this moment. These men who spent half a century searching for the British nurse who'd defied orders to treat enemy wounded, who'd shared her own rations with starving prisoners, who'd risked court-martial to save lives that her commanders considered worthless. One of them, Klaus Hoffmann, now 81, steps forward with tears streaming down his face and says in careful English, "You saved my life when you had every reason to let me die. You gave me the chance to meet my daughter, to hold my grandchildren. Everything I have, I owe to you." The medal, a belated military cross for gallantry, came not through British military recognition, but through a decades-long campaign by former enemies who refused to let her heroism be forgotten, who collected testimonies and petitioned governments, who insisted that saving lives mattered more than which flag those lives fought under. Elizabeth, who'd worked as a district nurse in rural England for 40 years after the war, who'd never spoken publicly about her service, who'd been denied recognition because she'd treated enemy wounded against explicit orders, finally receives acknowledgement not from her own government, but from the men whose nations had been at war with hers. The story of Elizabeth Harding represents a profound challenge to how we think about heroism in war, about the boundaries of compassion, and about who deserves recognition when their courage violated the tribal logic that makes war possible. By 1995, when this ceremony occurred, over 70,000 British nurses had served during World War II, many in combat zones where they faced the same dangers as frontline soldiers, but received a fraction of the recognition. The British military had awarded thousands of medals to male soldiers for bravery under fire, but nurses, despite treating wounded under bombardment, despite being captured and imprisoned, despite mortality rates that in some theatres exceeded infantry rates, were rarely honoured with combat gallantry medals because their service was categorised as auxiliary rather than combatant. Elizabeth's case was particularly egregious because her actions that merited recognition were also the actions that had nearly destroyed her career. In December 1944, as a 37-year-old nursing sister attached to a field hospital near Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, she'd made a choice that military regulations explicitly forbade. She'd treated German POWs with the same priority and care as Allied wounded, using limited medical supplies on enemy soldiers, and when superior officers ordered her to stop, she'd refused. This refusal led to her being removed from her posting, investigated for insubordination, and effectively blacklisted from military nursing, ending her war service in disgrace despite having saved countless lives, including those of Allied soldiers. The numbers tell part of the story but miss the human complexity. Between December 16th and 25th, 1944, the Battle of the Bulge produced over 19,000 American casualties in 9 days, overwhelming field hospitals that were designed for steady flow rather than catastrophic surge. German casualties were equally severe, over 67,000 killed, wounded or captured during the entire offensive. Field hospitals near the front lines found themselves treating wounded from both sides as the fluid combat situation left German prisoners in American custody faster than they could be evacuated. Military medical protocols were clear. Allied wounded received priority, with enemy prisoners treated only after all friendly casualties had been addressed and only with medical supplies that exceeded Allied needs. But Elizabeth Harding, along with a handful of other medical personnel who shared her perspective, believed that medical ethics transcended military necessity, that a wounded 19-year-old German conscript was as deserving of morphine for his pain as a wounded 19-year-old American GI, that her oath to relieve suffering didn't include a clause about national loyalty. This position, while morally defensible to her, was operationally intolerable to military commanders who needed every resource directed toward keeping their own soldiers combat effective and who couldn't allow individual medical personnel to substitute their ethical judgments for military orders. The question that haunts this story, and that would haunt Elizabeth for 50 years until the former POWs found her, is whether doing the right thing matters when everyone in authority tells you you're wrong, when your own side punishes you for compassion, when the people you save can't advocate for you because they're enemy prisoners, scattered across prisoner camps and then sent home to a devastated Germany where survival took precedence over remembering. How many heroes go unrecognized because their heroism violated the rules that their society imposed? How many acts of moral courage are punished rather than rewarded because they challenge the tribal boundaries that make group cohesion possible? And what does it mean about our values when former enemies have to campaign for 50 years to get recognition for someone their own government wanted to forget? To understand Elizabeth Harding and the choices she made that December, we need to understand the world that shaped her. A Britain of the 1930s where women's professional opportunities were limited, where nursing was one of few respectable careers for working-class women with intelligence and ambition, and where the gathering storm of another world war was creating demand for nurses who could handle trauma that the Great War generation hoped never to see again. Elizabeth was born in 1917 in Coventry, an industrial city in the English Midlands, to a family that embodied British working-class respectability. Her father worked as a machinist in an automotive factory, her mother took in sewing to supplement the family income, and young Elizabeth was the eldest of 4 children in a household where education was valued, but university was financially impossible. She attended grammar school on scholarship, excelled in sciences, particularly biology, and at 17 entered nursing training at Coventry Hospital, beginning the apprenticeship system that would shape her into a registered nurse by age 21. Her training years, 1934-1938, coincided with Britain's slow recognition that Hitler's Germany represented an existential threat, that appeasement was failing, and that another war was likely coming, a realization that affected nursing education as instructors began emphasizing trauma care, triage under resource constraints, and the psychological skills needed to maintain composure when facing casualties that would overwhelm in peacetime. The cultural and historical context of British nursing in the late 1930s was shaped by the legacy of Florence Nightingale and the professionalization of nursing during the Victorian era, but also by class and gender hierarchies that made nursing simultaneously respected and subordinate. Nurses were considered noble and self-sacrificing, but they were also expected to be deferential to male doctors, to follow orders without question, and to accept that their expertise in patient care was less valued than physicians' medical knowledge. Military nursing added another layer of hierarchy. Nurses held officer ranks, but were clearly auxiliary personnel whose role was to support combat forces rather than having independent authority. This subordination would become crucial to Elizabeth's story, because when she prioritized medical ethics over military orders, she was violating not just specific commands, but deeply embedded expectations about women's role, about nurses' place in the hierarchy, and about the obligation to subordinate individual judgment to institutional authority. The fact that she was proven right, that the German POWs she saved included men who would later testify to having done nothing that warranted being left to die in agony, didn't matter to a military system that valued obedience over independent moral reasoning. When war came in September 1939, Elizabeth was 22, recently qualified as a registered nurse, and facing a choice between continuing in civilian practice or volunteering for military service. She chose the latter, driven by patriotism, certainly, but also by a nurse's recognition that her skills would be most needed where the suffering was greatest, and that running toward danger rather than away from it was what her profession demanded. She joined the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service in October 1939, underwent officer training that emphasized military protocol and discipline, and was initially posted to a military hospital in southern England, treating evacuees from Dunkirk in May-June 1940. Her first exposure to mass casualties came during those weeks when over 300,000 British and French soldiers were evacuated from France, many wounded, all traumatized, and the hospitals overwhelmed by the sheer volume. Elizabeth, like most nurses, worked 18-hour shifts, treated wounds that ranged from minor shrapnel injuries to devastating trauma that required amputations or that were obviously fatal, and learned the psychological skills of remaining functional while surrounded by suffering. She also learned triage, the brutal calculus of allocating limited resources to maximize survival, of categorizing wounded into those who would survive without treatment, those who would die regardless of treatment, and those for whom treatment made the difference. This triage training would later create the moral conflict that defined her story, because triage logic says, You prioritize those most likely to benefit, but it assumes all lives have equal value, an assumption that military medicine during war explicitly rejected. Between 1940 and 1944, Elizabeth served in field hospitals in North Africa and Italy, following the Allied campaigns that pushed Axis forces back through brutal combat, where casualties were constant and medical resources were strained. She treated British, Canadian, and American soldiers, learning to work with multinational teams, and she also treated Italian and German POWs when they came through the medical system. Her approach to POW treatment was professional, but not particularly compassionate. She followed regulations, provided adequate care, but didn't go beyond requirements because she accepted the military logic that enemy wounded were lower priority. What changed her perspective was a specific incident in Italy in September 1943, shortly after the Italian surrender, when a young German prisoner, perhaps 17, conscripted from Austria, severely wounded with abdominal injuries, was brought to her field hospital. The boy was delirious with pain and infection, calling for his mother in German, and Elizabeth found herself unable to maintain professional distance. She treated him with the same intensity she would have treated a British soldier, sat with him during his final hours, when she should have been treating others, and held his hand as he died, far from home in a war he'd had no choice about joining. That experience shattered her ability to see enemy soldiers as abstract others, rather than as terrified young men who'd been conscripted into fighting for a cause many of them didn't believe in, and it created a moral crisis that she couldn't resolve through the frameworks military nursing provided. The challenge Elizabeth faced wasn't technical. She was an excellent nurse with 4 years of combat zone experience who could handle trauma that would overwhelm less experienced personnel, but ethical and institutional. Military medical ethics during wartime prioritized military effectiveness over universal care. You kept your own soldiers alive and combat-ready, you conserved resources, and you didn't waste limited supplies on enemy personnel who, even if saved, would just go to POW camps rather than contributing to the war effort. This framework was defensible from a military perspective. If you only have enough morphine for 10 patients, and you have 8 Allied wounded and 12 enemy wounded, giving morphine to enemy soldiers means some of your own soldiers suffer needlessly. But Elizabeth came to believe this framework was morally bankrupt because it reduced human beings to military assets, because it violated the fundamental medical principle that suffering deserves relief regardless of who suffers, and because it required her to ignore her own responses to wounded young men who were victims of war as much as the soldiers on her side were. This moral conviction would put her on a collision course with military authority during the Battle of the Bulge, when resource constraints were most severe and when military pressure to prioritize Allied wounded was most intense. By December 1944, Elizabeth had been promoted to nursing sister, equivalent to a captain in rank, and was serving at a field hospital designated Evacuation Hospital 42, positioned about 10 miles behind the front lines near Bastogne, Belgium. The hospital had been established in November to support the Allied advance into Germany, was staffed by 60 medical personnel, including 8 nurses, and was designed to provide stabilizing care before evacuating wounded to better-equipped hospitals farther behind the lines. When the German Ardennes offensive began on December 16th, everything changed. The American units defending the sector were overrun or encircled, casualties flooded the hospital in numbers it wasn't designed to handle, and German prisoners began arriving in groups as local American forces captured stragglers, or as German soldiers surrendered when they realized their offensive was failing. The hospital found itself treating over 200 patients in a facility designed for 80, with critical shortages of morphine, plasma, bandages, and antibiotics. The medical officer in command, Major Robert Sullivan, issued explicit orders. Allied wounded received all available resources first. German POWs received basic stabilization only. Splints for fractures, pressure dressings for bleeding, but no morphine for pain, no plasma for shock, no antibiotics for infection, and no surgery except in cases where German wounded could be quickly patched and moved to POW camps to free bed space. Elizabeth found these orders unconscionable, particularly as she watched German wounded suffer from pain that morphine could have relieved, from shock that plasma could have reversed, from infections that penicillin could have cured. The German prisoners in her ward included men with terrible injuries. One had lost both legs to a mine, another had severe burns from a tank fire, A third had a sucking chest wound that was slowly drowning him in his own blood. Under Sullivan's orders, these men received minimal care while they waited for transport to POW facilities, and some died from injuries that would have been survivable with treatment. Elizabeth began borrowing morphine from Allied supplies to inject German prisoners whose pain was excruciating, began misallocating plasma by claiming Allied patients needed it when she was actually giving it to German prisoners in shock, and began advocating loudly to Sullivan that medical ethics required treating severe injuries regardless of uniform. Her actions were motivated by compassion, but they were also pragmatic. POW transport was disrupted by combat, which meant German wounded remained in the field hospital for days, taking up beds and nursing attention, and keeping them sedated and comfortable actually improved efficiency, compared to having them screaming in pain and disrupting care for other patients. Sullivan ordered her to stop, citing regulations and resource constraints, and reminding her that her primary obligation was to Allied soldiers. Elizabeth refused, arguing that her primary obligation was to relieve suffering and that no military regulation could require her to ignore a medical emergency. Sullivan then ordered other nurses and medics to monitor her and report any further violations, essentially putting her under surveillance within her own workplace. Elizabeth responded by recruiting sympathetic medics who shared her views, by becoming more covert in her resource diversion, and by documenting everything: patient names, injuries, treatment provided, outcomes, in a notebook that she kept hidden, evidence she thought might be needed if she faced court-martial. The situation climaxed on December 23rd, when a German prisoner, Klaus Hoffmann, arrived with a severe compound fracture of his femur that was causing life-threatening bleeding from a torn femoral artery. Standard treatment required immediate surgery to clamp the artery, but Sullivan refused to authorize operating theater time for an enemy soldier when Allied wounded were waiting for surgery. Elizabeth argued that Hoffmann would die within hours without surgery, that the operation would take less than an hour, and that letting him die when treatment was available was medical murder. Sullivan maintained that resource allocation was his decision, not hers, that Hoffmann would go to the POW camp where German medical personnel could treat him, and that Elizabeth's continued insubordination would result in her removal from duty and charges filed. Elizabeth made a decision that would define her life. She waited until Sullivan left the hospital to inspect another facility, enlisted a sympathetic surgeon and 2 medics, and performed the surgery on Hoffmann without authorization. The operation was successful, the artery was clamped, bleeding stopped, and Hoffmann stabilized. But when Sullivan returned and discovered what she'd done, he immediately relieved her of duty, confined her to quarters, and initiated charges of insubordination, misappropriation of medical supplies, and conduct unbecoming an officer. Elizabeth was removed from Evacuation Hospital 42 on December 26th, transported to a rear area facility for investigation, and by February 1945 was formally reprimanded, demoted from nursing sister to staff nurse, losing her officer rank, and reassigned to a non-combat administrative position in England, where she would finish out the war processing medical records rather than treating patients. The reprimand cited her persistent refusal to follow lawful orders regarding resource allocation and prioritization of enemy medical needs over Allied military objectives, and while she avoided court-martial, probably because prosecuting a nurse for being too compassionate would have been public relations disaster, her career was effectively ended and her reputation in military nursing destroyed. What Elizabeth didn't know during those miserable months of investigation and punishment was that Klaus Hoffmann and 5 other German prisoners she'd treated were compiling their own documentation, written statements about her care, testimony about her defiance of orders to help them, and a collective vow that if they survived the war, they would find her and ensure her heroism was recognized. Hoffmann, whose leg Elizabeth had saved, spent the rest of the war in a POW camp where he worked as a medic treating other prisoners. He told everyone about the British nurse who'd risked everything to save him, who'd shared her own food with prisoners who were starving, who'd proven that humanity could transcend the hatred war required. He collected names and details from other prisoners who'd been treated at Evacuation Hospital 42, creating a network of witnesses whose testimony, he believed, would eventually vindicate her. But the immediate aftermath of the war made this vindication seem impossible. Hoffmann returned to a devastated Germany where survival required all his energy, where locating a British nurse whose surname he knew, but whose first name he'd never learned, seemed hopeless, and where former German soldiers were not in a position to petition British authorities for anything. The years between 1945 and 1995, the 50 years it took for Elizabeth to receive recognition, were filled with frustration and determination on both sides. Elizabeth returned to civilian nursing in England, working in district nursing in rural Worcestershire, treating ordinary illnesses and injuries, and never speaking publicly about her war service, because the reprimand in her military record made her ashamed, and because the culture of post-war Britain emphasized moving forward rather than dwelling on wartime controversies. She married in 1948, a doctor she'd worked with briefly who knew her story and admired her courage, had 2 children, and built a quiet, respectable life that bore no external resemblance to the wartime drama that haunted her privately. She suffered from what we now recognize as moral injury, psychological trauma that occurs not from fear or danger, but from witnessing or participating in actions that violate deeply held values. In Elizabeth's case, the trauma came from having been punished for doing what she knew was right, from watching prisoners suffer when she had power to help them but was forbidden to act, and from the knowledge that her government valued obedience over compassion. She experienced depression, difficulty sleeping, and a persistent sense that her life's most meaningful work had been invalidated by people who'd never understood what frontline medical care required. Meanwhile, Klaus Hoffmann spent those same decades searching for her. His quest took years because he didn't have her first name, didn't know where she'd gone after the war, and had only the vaguest information about which British nursing service she'd belonged to. He wrote letters to British military records offices that went unanswered, contacted veteran organizations that couldn't help, and gradually built a network of the other German POWs she'd treated, collecting testimonies and creating a dossier of evidence about her actions. The breakthrough came in 1991, when changes after German reunification made East German records accessible, and Hoffmann found records from a POW camp that included Elizabeth's full name from documentation about his own treatment. With her full name, he could search British records, and by 1993 he'd located her in Worcestershire, elderly but still alive. The reunion between Elizabeth and the men she'd saved was emotional and cathartic. Hoffmann and 5 others traveled to England, met with Elizabeth, shared what their lives had been like because she'd saved them, and told her they'd spent decades trying to find her to say thank you. They learned about her reprimand, about the destruction of her military nursing career, and they were appalled that she'd been punished rather than honored. They made it their mission to get her properly recognized, petitioning British authorities, contacting members of Parliament, and creating a media campaign that presented her story as a testament to medical ethics and human compassion transcending war's hatreds. The British government's initial response was bureaucratic resistance. The military maintained that her actions had violated regulations, that those regulations existed for sound reasons, and that posthumously overturning disciplinary decisions would set dangerous precedents. But public pressure built as newspapers ran stories about the German Veterans Campaign, as medical ethics organizations endorsed her actions, and as the contrast between male soldiers receiving gallantry medals for courage and a female nurse being punished for compassion became politically untenable. In October 1995, the British government announced that Elizabeth Harding would receive a military cross for gallantry, the citation emphasizing her extraordinary courage in providing medical care under combat conditions and her unwavering commitment to medical ethics, despite significant personal risk. The ceremony in Brussels, attended by the German veterans whose testimony had made recognition possible, was the culmination of 50 years of injustice finally being addressed, and it represented a remarkable statement about values, that former enemies could recognize and honor courage that their own side had missed, that compassion deserved recognition even when it violated orders, and that the moral arc, though agonizingly slow, sometimes does bend toward justice. The resolution and legacy of Elizabeth Harding's story extends far beyond her individual case to influence medical ethics, military policy, and broader conversations about how we recognize heroism and whom we allow to be heroes. Elizabeth lived another 8 years after receiving her medal, dying in 2003 at age 86, and she spent those years speaking about medical ethics and advocating for changes to how military medicine treats enemy wounded. Her core argument was that the Geneva Convention's requirements for treating POWs weren't being adequately implemented in practice, that medical personnel needed protection from retaliation when they advocated for patients regardless of nationality, and that military medical ethics should explicitly state that doctors and nurses have obligations to patients that transcend military chain of command. Some of these reforms were implemented. NATO guidelines for military medicine now emphasize that medical personnel must prioritize medical need over national identity when resources allow, and military medical personnel receive ethics training that explicitly addresses the tension between military orders and medical obligations. But Elizabeth also argued that the broader problem was how military culture conceptualizes heroism as primarily about defeating enemies and destroying things, when arguably the harder and braver choice is often to preserve life and maintain humanity in contexts where hatred is easier than compassion. The impact on subsequent conflicts and military medical practice has been mixed. During wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, American and British military medical personnel treated enemy wounded routinely, and there are documented cases of medical staff advocating forcefully for adequate treatment of detainees and prisoners. But there are also documented cases of medical personnel participating in torture or providing inadequate care to enemy prisoners, and the cultural tension between military necessity and medical ethics remains unresolved. Elizabeth's story has become a teaching case in military medical ethics courses, used to explore questions about when obedience to orders is morally required and when it's morally forbidden, about how medical personnel should respond when commanders make decisions that violate medical principles, and about what protection should exist for medical personnel who prioritize patient welfare over military objectives. These are questions without simple answers, but Elizabeth's case demonstrates that hiding behind just following orders isn't adequate justification when the orders require causing preventable suffering. The broader cultural legacy involves changing how we think about war heroism, and particularly about recognizing women's contributions to war efforts. The campaigns to recognize women's wartime service, including nurses, resistance fighters, factory workers, and others whose contributions were essential but undervalued, have gained momentum in recent decades, with monuments erected, medals awarded posthumously, and historical narratives revised to acknowledge that war is won not just by soldiers destroying enemy forces, but by everyone working to preserve life, maintain supply lines, treat wounded, and sustain morale. Elizabeth's case was unusual because she was punished for her heroism, but it was typical in that her heroism involved care work rather than combat, involved defying authority rather than following it, and involved treating enemies as human rather than as abstractions to be destroyed. The fact that recognition took 50 years and required former enemies to advocate for her says something profound about whose heroism gets recognized immediately and whose has to fight for acknowledgement across decades. The psychological dimension of Elizabeth's story involves moral injury and its healing. For 50 years, Elizabeth carried the burden of knowing she'd done right, but being told she was wrong, of being proud of saving lives but ashamed of the reprimand, of feeling that her most meaningful work was also her greatest professional failure. That cognitive dissonance created psychological suffering that manifested in depression, in difficulty trusting authority, in hypervigilance about protecting her reputation, and in a persistent sense that the world was unjust. The 1995 ceremony didn't erase that suffering. You can't undo 50 years of invalidation with a medal, but it did provide something crucial: external validation that her internal moral compass had been right, that the authorities who punished her had been wrong, and that her sacrifice had meaning that others recognized. The German veterans who advocated for her provided additional healing by demonstrating that her actions had lasting impact, that the lives she saved had value, measured not just in abstract ethical terms, but in concrete descendants who existed because Klaus Hoffmann's leg had been saved, because prisoners received morphine for their pain, because one nurse had insisted that humanity mattered more than regulations. For the German veterans, their campaign to recognize Elizabeth was also about their own healing. They'd spent decades carrying guilt about the war, about Germany's crimes, about the shame of having been on the wrong side. Finding Elizabeth and getting her recognized allowed them to do something redemptive, to honor someone who treated them as human when they were enemies, to demonstrate that Germans could recognize and celebrate moral courage even when it came from an Allied nurse who'd had every reason to hate them, and to prove that reconciliation was possible not through forgetting the past, but through honoring those who'd maintained their humanity despite the past. Klaus Hoffmann described the 1995 ceremony as closing a circle that had been open for 50 years, as finally being able to repay a debt of life that he'd carried since Elizabeth saved his leg. The other veterans echoed this sentiment, describing relief and completeness that came from witnessing justice finally done. So what do we take from Elizabeth Harding's story, the nurse who was punished for compassion and vindicated by former enemies 50 years later? First, that moral courage often requires defying authority, that doing the right thing sometimes means breaking rules, and that societies don't always recognize heroism when it challenges their assumptions about loyalty and obedience. Second, that enemies can be more generous than friends, that the people we're taught to hate can sometimes see our value more clearly than those on our own side, and that nationality matters less than character when evaluating who deserves recognition. Third, that vindication, while important, can never fully compensate for decades of injustice, that being proven right 50 years later doesn't erase the suffering of being told you were wrong when it mattered most, but that it does provide closure and meaning that makes the struggle worthwhile. Fourth, that the work of remembering and honoring often falls to unlikely people. 6 elderly German veterans who spent decades searching for a British nurse, not because they had to, but because they chose to, because gratitude and justice mattered more than convenience. Fifth, that systems that punish compassion need to be challenged, that military medical ethics must protect personnel who prioritize patient welfare, and that the excuse of following orders can never justify causing preventable suffering when treatment is available. As we close this chapter of World War II history, think about the unrecognized heroes in your own family or community, the people who did extraordinary things that nobody noticed, who were punished for being right, who spent decades waiting for acknowledgement that never came or came too late. Drop a comment sharing stories of delayed recognition, of people whose heroism was unconventional, of former enemies who became friends, of justice that took generations to arrive. If this story moved you, if it changed how you think about heroism or authority, or the obligations we have to people designated as enemies, hit that like button to help others discover that the most important acts of courage are often the quietest and the least celebrated. Subscribe for more stories about World War II that challenge comfortable narratives, that show the moral complexity beneath the simple story of good defeating evil, that honor the people history tried to forget. Click the notification bell for our next video examining other cases where recognition took decades: the Tuskegee Airmen, the Navajo Code Talkers, the women of Bletchley Park, and what those delays reveal about whose contributions we value immediately versus whose we have to be shamed into acknowledging. Until then, remember that Elizabeth Harding's military cross sits in a museum now, displayed alongside testimonies from 6 German veterans whose lives she saved and whose gratitude proved more powerful than the system that tried to erase her. That's the history worth preserving, the history that teaches us to question authority when it demands cruelty, to recognize heroes wherever we find them, even if they were supposed to be enemies, and to understand that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to hate. Thank you for watching, and never forget that 50 years is too long to wait for justice, but it's never too late to say thank you. The specific medical procedures and decisions that Elizabeth made during those critical December days deserve closer examination because they reveal the practical reality of combat nursing and the moment-by-moment choices that transform abstract ethical principles into concrete actions with life and death consequences. When Klaus Hoffmann arrived at Evacuation Hospital 42 on December 23rd, with his shattered femur and torn femoral artery, Elizabeth had approximately 3 hours before blood loss would become irreversible and Hoffmann would die. The standard protocol for compound femoral fractures with arterial involvement required surgical intervention within 4 to 6 hours, and every minute of delay increased the risk of permanent damage or death. Elizabeth assessed Hoffmann's condition. His pulse was rapid and weak at 130 beats per minute. His blood pressure was dangerously low at 70/40, and he was showing signs of hypovolemic shock, including confusion, pale, clammy skin, and decreased urine output. She calculated that he'd already lost approximately 40% of his blood volume, which meant he needed immediate blood transfusion followed by surgery to clamp the artery and stabilize the fracture, or he would progress to irreversible shock and die regardless of later intervention. The technical challenge was that surgery required an operating theater, surgical team, anesthesia, and blood products, all resources that were stretched impossibly thin by the flood of Allied casualties from the ongoing battle. Major Sullivan's refusal to authorize surgery for Hoffman wasn't arbitrary cruelty, but resource triage. The field hospital had 2 operating theaters, both currently occupied with surgeries on American soldiers, and a waiting list of 6 more Americans requiring surgery. Allocating theater time to a German prisoner meant delaying surgery for an American, which could mean the American died while waiting. This was the brutal calculus that military medicine required, and Sullivan's decision followed established protocols and reasonable military logic. But Elizabeth saw a different calculus. Hoffman was a patient with a survivable injury if treated promptly, and she had the skills and resources to save him, which meant that letting him die was choosing to allow death when preventing it was possible. The fact that he was German was, from her medical perspective, irrelevant to the ethical obligation to prevent preventable death. When Sullivan left the hospital to inspect another facility, Elizabeth made her decision knowing exactly what it would cost her. She approached Captain James Wright, the surgeon who'd worked with her on previous cases and who shared her ethical concerns about POW treatment. Wright was reluctant. He understood that performing unauthorized surgery could end both their careers, but Elizabeth argued that they had a brief window when both operating theaters would be free for rotation and cleaning, that Hoffman's surgery could be completed in under an hour, and that they could present it as an emergency procedure that couldn't wait for authorization. Wright agreed, with the stipulation that Elizabeth take full responsibility if Sullivan objected, which she immediately accepted. They assembled a team, 1 anesthetist, 2 surgical nurses, and 2 medics who would assist, and who were sworn to secrecy about the circumstances. The operation began at 14:30 hours and proceeded with the controlled urgency that combat surgery required. Wright made an incision to expose the damaged artery, found the tear in the femoral wall, clamped the vessel above and below the damage, repaired the tear with surgical sutures, verified that blood flow was restored, then stabilized the compound fracture with internal fixation using a metal rod. The entire procedure took 55 minutes, and by 15-25 hours, Hoffman was in recovery with stable vital signs and a prognosis for full recovery if infection could be prevented. Elizabeth's documentation of this surgery in her hidden notebook included technical details, but also a personal reflection that revealed her state of mind. I know this will likely end my military nursing career. I know Sullivan will be furious and will press charges. But I also know that if I'd let this boy die when I could save him, I would have lost something essential about who I am as a nurse and as a human being. There are rules and regulations, and they exist for reasons, but there are also principles that transcend rules. And one of those principles is that when you have the power to prevent death and the knowledge to prevent suffering, you have an obligation to act. I will accept whatever consequences come, but I will not accept becoming the kind of person who lets patients die because saving them is inconvenient or unauthorized. This passage, discovered decades later when Elizabeth donated her papers to a military nursing archive, captures the moral clarity that guided her, even as she understood the personal costs. When Sullivan returned and discovered what had occurred, his rage was immediate and comprehensive. He viewed Elizabeth's action not just as insubordination, but as betrayal, a violation of his authority, a breach of military discipline, and a dangerous precedent that could undermine the entire command structure if allowed to stand. His response was to immediately relieve her of duty, confine her to quarters, and begin paperwork for court-martial on charges that carried potential penalties ranging from dishonorable discharge to imprisonment. The investigation that followed consumed 6 weeks, during which Elizabeth was interrogated repeatedly about her actions, her motivations, and her attitude toward military authority. The investigators' questions revealed the military's concerns. Was she a pacifist who opposed the war effort? Was she sympathetic to Germany? Did she understand that her actions diverted resources from Allied soldiers? Did she recognize that following orders was essential to military effectiveness? Elizabeth's answers were consistent and uncompromising. She wasn't a pacifist. She fully supported defeating Nazi Germany. She understood resource constraints, but she believed medical ethics required treating severe injuries regardless of nationality, and that following orders couldn't require her to ignore medical emergencies when she had the knowledge and resources to respond. The decision not to court-martial Elizabeth, but instead to administratively discipline her, reflected the military's recognition that prosecuting a nurse for being too compassionate would be public relations disaster. The British public in 1945 was celebrating victory and mourning losses, and the image of the military punishing a nurse for saving lives, even enemy lives, would undermine the narrative that Britain had fought the war for civilized values against Nazi barbarism. But the military also couldn't let her actions stand without consequences, because that would establish precedent that medical personnel could substitute their judgment for commanders' orders, potentially undermining discipline across the medical corps. The compromise was formal reprimand, demotion and reassignment to non-combat duties, punishment severe enough to discourage others from similar defiance, but not so severe as to create a martyr or scandal. For Elizabeth, this compromise felt like the worst of both outcomes. She was punished enough to destroy her career and reputation, but not vindicated by the trial that court-martial would have provided, where she could have made her case publicly and forced the military to defend prioritizing nationality over medical need. The years Elizabeth spent in administrative exile, processing medical records in England while the war ground toward conclusion, were psychologically devastating in ways that combat nursing hadn't been. In combat zones, she'd been exhausted and stressed, but purposeful. Her skills mattered, her decisions affected outcomes, and she was part of something larger than herself. In administrative work, she was effectively punished by being made useless, by having her expertise and experience wasted on paperwork that any clerk could perform, by being visibly demoted in a way that signaled to everyone that she'd done something wrong, even though she knew she'd done something right. The psychological literature on moral injury identifies this experience, being punished for acting according to deeply held values, as particularly damaging because it creates cognitive dissonance that can't be resolved. You know you were right, but the world treats you as if you were wrong, creating a split between internal conviction and external validation that prevents psychological closure. Elizabeth experienced depression, insomnia, and intrusive memories of the patients she could have saved if she'd remained in combat nursing, and she developed a cynicism about authority that stayed with her for life. The parallel story of what happened to Klaus Hoffmann and the other German POWs Elizabeth treated illuminates how her actions rippled beyond the immediate medical outcomes to create bonds that transcended the war's hatreds. Hoffmann spent the remainder of the war in a POW camp in Belgium and then France, where he worked as a medic treating other German prisoners. He told everyone about the British nurse who'd saved his leg despite orders, who'd shared her food with prisoners, who'd treated Germans with the same care as British soldiers. Other prisoners who'd been at Evacuation Hospital 42 told similar stories, creating a collective narrative about a nurse whose compassion had proven that not everyone accepted the dehumanization that war required. These stories served psychological functions for the prisoners. They provided hope that not all enemies hated them. They challenged the Nazi propaganda they'd absorbed about Allied brutality, and they offered moral frameworks for processing their own participation in a war they were increasingly recognizing as unjust. Hoffmann later reflected that Elizabeth had given him not just his life, but a model of how to think about enemies, that nationality didn't determine moral worth, that individuals could choose compassion over tribal loyalty, and that healing was always possible even in contexts of maximum conflict. When the war ended and German POWs were repatriated, Hoffmann returned to Munich to discover that his parents had survived the war, but his younger brother had been killed on the Eastern Front. His childhood home had been destroyed in Allied bombing, and the Munich he remembered was rubble and starvation. The physical reconstruction of Germany was accompanied by psychological reckoning that most Germans weren't prepared to undertake. The revelation of Holocaust atrocities, the Nuremberg trials, the occupation by Allied forces, and the pervasive sense of collective guilt created psychological crisis for a nation that had to confront what it had supported or tolerated. Hoffmann, like many German veterans, struggled with this reckoning. He hadn't personally participated in atrocities. He'd been a conscript who'd fought because refusing meant death or imprisonment, but he was part of a military that had committed genocide, and he wore a uniform that symbolized those crimes. The memory of Elizabeth's compassion provided partial psychological resolution. If an enemy nurse could see him as worthy of saving, then perhaps he wasn't irredeemably tainted by his nation's crimes. Perhaps individual moral choices mattered more than collective guilt. Hoffmann's decision to search for Elizabeth emerged gradually during the 1950s. As Germany rebuilt and as his own life stabilized, He married in 1952, had 2 children, worked as a medical technician at a Munich hospital. He began writing letters to British veterans organisations, to military records offices, to nursing associations, all asking if anyone knew of a British nurse named Elizabeth, who'd served at a field hospital near Bastogne in December 1944. The responses were mostly unhelpful. Military records were incomplete, personnel movements during the Battle of the Bulge had been chaotic, and many organisations were reluctant to help a former German soldier find a British nurse because the purpose was unclear and possibly suspicious. But Hoffman persisted, gradually building a network of other German veterans who'd been treated at Evacuation Hospital 42 and who shared his determination to find the nurse who'd saved them. By the 1960s, they had a list of 6 former POWs who could testify to Elizabeth's actions, and they'd collected written statements describing her treatment, her defiance of orders, and the impact she'd had on their lives. The breakthrough came in 1991 when the reunification of Germany made previously classified records from East German archives available. Hoffman discovered POW records that included full medical documentation from his treatment at Evacuation Hospital 42, including Elizabeth's signature as treating nurse and her full name, Elizabeth Mary Harding. With this information, he could search British nursing records more effectively, and by 1993 he'd located her through the British Nursing Register, which showed she was living in Worcestershire and had retired from district nursing in 1982. Hoffman wrote her a letter explaining who he was, how she'd saved his life, and expressing his gratitude for what she'd done 50 years earlier. Elizabeth's response, according to her later interviews, was emotional and conflicted. She was deeply moved that Hoffman had remembered and searched for her, but she was also anxious about revisiting a period of her life that had caused so much pain and shame. She agreed to meet him when he proposed visiting England, and that meeting in 1993 was transformative for both of them. The reunion was held at Elizabeth's home in Worcestershire, with Hoffman travelling from Munich, accompanied by 2 other veterans she'd treated. Elizabeth was 76, widowed with grown children and grandchildren, living a quiet retirement that bore no external signs of wartime drama. Hoffman was 79, still physically fit, with a slight limp from the leg injury that Elizabeth had repaired. Their conversation lasted hours, with Hoffman describing what her care had meant to him, showing her photographs of his children and grandchildren, descendants who existed because she'd saved his life, and explaining that he'd spent decades trying to find her to say thank you. Elizabeth told him about the reprimand, about the destruction of her military nursing career, about the 50 years she'd carried the burden of being punished for doing what she'd known was right. Hoffman was appalled and immediately declared that getting her properly recognized would be his mission, that the British government needed to acknowledge what she'd done and compensate for the injustice of punishing her. The campaign that Hoffman and the other German veterans launched to get Elizabeth recognized was methodical and strategic, using media attention, political pressure, and appeals to British values to build momentum for official acknowledgement. They contacted British newspapers with the story, framing it as a testament to medical ethics and British compassion that transcended war's hatreds. They reached out to members of Parliament, particularly those representing districts with large veteran populations, arguing that Elizabeth's story embodied the values Britain claimed to have fought for. They enlisted medical ethics organisations, nursing associations and religious leaders to endorse the campaign. And they presented themselves not as asking for favours, but as demanding justice, that a British nurse who'd upheld the highest standards of medical care deserved recognition rather than punishment, and that the fact that former enemies had to campaign for her recognition was indictment of British failure to honour her appropriately. The campaign gained traction throughout 1994 and 1995, with media coverage creating public pressure on the government to act. The British government's response evolved from resistance to reluctant acknowledgement, as public opinion made the political costs of continued refusal too high. Initially, the Ministry of Defence maintained that Elizabeth had violated regulations, that those violations had been appropriately disciplined, and that reopening decades-old disciplinary cases would create problematic precedents. But this position became untenable, as newspapers ran editorials condemning the bureaucracy that punished compassion, as nursing organisations threatened to protest publicly, and as opposition politicians used the case to criticise the government's treatment of veterans and medical personnel. In June 1995, The government announced that Elizabeth Harding would receive a military cross for gallantry, with the citation carefully worded to emphasize her courage and medical skills while avoiding explicit acknowledgement that her punishment had been unjust. The medal ceremony was scheduled for October 1995 in Brussels, symbolically positioned in Belgium near where the events had occurred, and emphasizing the European reconciliation that had transformed former enemies into allies. The ceremony itself was emotionally charged and symbolically powerful, attended by Elizabeth in a wheelchair due to age-related mobility issues, the 6 German veterans who'd campaigned for her recognition, British military officials who delivered the medal, and media representatives who documented the event for posterity. Hoffman gave a speech describing Elizabeth's actions and their impact. "This woman saved my life when military regulations said she shouldn't. She treated me with dignity when I was an enemy prisoner, with no claim on her compassion. She shared her food when she was hungry, she gave me morphine when supplies were limited, and she performed surgery to save my leg when her commander had forbidden it. Everything I have, my wife, my children, my grandchildren, my 45 years of work as a medical technician helping others, I owe to her courage and to her refusal to let regulations override her humanity." The British government punished her for 50 years for being too compassionate. Today we celebrate that they have finally, belatedly, acknowledged what we have known since 1944, that Elizabeth Harding is a hero who deserves recognition and honor. Elizabeth's acceptance was briefer and more emotional, her voice breaking as she said, "I did what any nurse should do when faced with a patient in need. I don't regret my actions, only that it took 50 years and former enemies advocating on my behalf for my own country to acknowledge that medical ethics matter more than national boundaries. I accept this medal not for myself, but for all medical personnel who face impossible choices between following orders and following their conscience, and I hope that future nurses will have clearer guidance and better protection when they choose compassion over compliance." The media coverage of the ceremony emphasized the redemptive narrative, enemies transformed into advocates, justice delayed but ultimately delivered, the triumph of universal human values over the tribal logic of war. But the coverage often missed the deeper implications about institutional resistance to acknowledging mistakes, about how hierarchy protects itself by punishing dissenters, and about whose heroism gets recognized immediately versus whose requires decades of advocacy. Elizabeth's case was unusual in that recognition eventually came, but it was typical in that compassionate actions by women, particularly actions that violated masculine military norms of obedience and aggression, faced much higher barriers to recognition than conventionally heroic actions by men. The fact that it required former enemies campaigning for 50 years revealed how deeply entrenched those biases were and how resistant institutions are to admitting they were wrong. The final 8 years of Elizabeth's life, from the 1995 ceremony until her death in 2003, were marked by increased public recognition, speaking engagements about medical ethics, and reflection on what her experience revealed about values and institutions. She became a sought-after speaker at nursing conferences, medical ethics symposia, and veterans organizations, using her story to advocate for stronger protections for medical personnel who prioritize patient welfare over institutional pressure. Her central message was that medical ethics couldn't be subordinate to military necessity, that doctors and nurses needed explicit protection from retaliation when they advocated for patients, and that societies claiming to value compassion needed to back that claim by honoring rather than punishing those who acted compassionately. She also advocated for stronger implementation of Geneva Convention requirements for POW medical treatment, arguing that regulations requiring adequate care were meaningless if military personnel faced punishment for providing it. Some of these reforms were implemented during her lifetime. NATO medical protocols were revised to emphasize patient welfare over nationality, and military medical ethics training incorporated case studies, including her own, to explore tensions between orders and obligations. Elizabeth also used her final years to reconnect with the German veterans who'd advocated for her, building friendships that transcended their former enemy status. Hoffman visited her annually until her death, and they corresponded regularly, discussing their families, their health, and their shared commitment to ensuring that younger generations understood the costs of war and the importance of maintaining humanity even in conflict. When Elizabeth died in 2003, Hoffman and 2 other German veterans attended her funeral in Worcestershire, delivering eulogies that emphasized how she'd changed their lives and taught them that enemies could be more compassionate than friends, that nationality mattered less than character, and that the courage to defy authority when authority demanded cruelty was the highest form of heroism. The British military sent representatives who acknowledged her service and sacrifice, and the military cross she'd received was placed in a military nursing museum, alongside testimonies from the German veterans whose lives she'd saved. The ultimate legacy of Elizabeth Harding's story extends beyond her individual case to influence how we think about medical ethics in conflict, about whose heroism deserves recognition, and about the courage required to prioritize universal human values over tribal loyalties that war demands. Her story has become a teaching case in medical ethics courses worldwide, used to explore questions about when obedience is morally required and when it's morally forbidden, about how medical personnel should navigate conflicts between military orders and patient welfare, and about what institutional protections are needed for personnel who prioritize ethics over hierarchy. The questions her story raises don't have simple answers. Should doctors treating battlefield casualties prioritize their own nation's soldiers? How should resource constraints be balanced against universal care obligations? What protections should exist for medical personnel who refuse orders they consider unethical? Different medical ethics frameworks answer differently, but Elizabeth's case demonstrates that hiding behind regulations isn't adequate justification when those regulations require causing preventable suffering. The story also illuminates broader questions about heroism and recognition in ways that feminist scholars have explored extensively. Elizabeth's actions, caring for wounded, defying authority to prevent suffering, maintaining compassion in contexts of hatred, embodied traditionally feminine virtues but required courage that military culture typically associates with masculine combat heroism. Her punishment reflected not just military necessity, but gendered assumptions about women's proper role. Nurses were supposed to be caring but obedient, compassionate but subordinate, supportive but not independent moral agents who could challenge male authority. The 50-year delay in recognition reflected institutional resistance to acknowledging that feminine care work could be as courageous as masculine combat, that defying orders could be as brave as following them, and that women who violated gender norms by insisting on their own moral judgment deserved honor rather than punishment. The fact that recognition required former enemies advocating demonstrated how deeply those gendered assumptions were embedded. Men who'd been enemies were more credible advocates than the woman herself, and their testimony carried weight that her own claims about her actions never could. So what do we finally take from Elizabeth Harding's complete story? The nursing sister, who defied orders to save enemy soldiers, who was punished by her own military, who spent 50 years carrying the burden of institutional injustice, and who was finally vindicated by the men she'd saved. We take the lesson that moral courage often requires accepting personal costs for standing by principles, that doing right doesn't guarantee recognition or reward, but that it provides something more important: the ability to live with yourself, to maintain integrity when pressures push toward compromising it, to be the person you want to be, rather than the person institutions demand. We take the recognition that enemies are often more generous than friends, that people we're taught to hate can recognize our worth more clearly than those on our own side, that transcending tribal boundaries requires individual courage that institutions actively discourage. We take the understanding that justice delayed is still important even when it can't compensate for injustice endured, that saying I was wrong and you deserve honor after 50 years doesn't erase the harm, but does provide closure and validation that matters profoundly. We take the challenge to our own institutions to recognize heroism wherever it appears, rather than only in forms that confirm existing hierarchies, to protect personnel who prioritize ethics over obedience, and to acknowledge that sometimes the most important courage is refusing to let authority override conscience. And we take Elizabeth's example as inspiration for our own choices about when to comply and when to defy, about whether rules matter more than people, about what kind of person we want to be when faced with suffering we have power to prevent but aren't authorized to address.